Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. Peter, it's great to be with you. And why don't you start by telling us about the traumatic start to this morning that you have had, because you had breakfast plans, but they have been ruined.
Absolute disaster. So at Care, we sometimes order in food on a Wednesday morning, which is great. But there was plenty left yesterday, so I've been counting on it still being there this morning.
Specifically, what were you hunting for?
Well, the Ben's cookies.
For your breakfast?
Well, absolutely.
Okay, yes.
Well, yes. To be fair, they were ordered in for everyone for breakfast on Wednesday.
That is true. That is true. Fair. And then what happened? Where was the cookie?
I don't know. They all seem to have gone.
That is
absolute
bad.
disaster.
Well, that is poor. That's fascinating. So I have it on good authority that after the staff meeting yesterday, there was a good number of cookies left. Hence, your decision to wait until this morning.
Indeed. We really should have taken a before and after photo, but...
I'm going to go on a limb here and ask you, who do you think is responsible? If you had to name a colleague.
Oh, no, I can't. I couldn't.
At whose door would you lay the blame?
I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus.
Fair, that's fine. Save that for off camera, shall we? Yes.
I think so. It'll be outtakes.
Absolutely. And apart from lacking breakfast this morning, are you well?
I am doing fine. I'm doing fine.
Enjoying the cricket result?
It was very exciting.
Yes. For those of you watching who don't know, we're both avid cricket fans, really just completing the stereotype of, well-educated white boys who just happen to love cricket. Yeah. And have managed to compliment us as well. How about that? But a fantastic result, an amazing fourth innings run chase to get 371, an amazing innings by Ben Duckett, 149 and then out. But I also give credit to someone like Joe Root, who just when we needed him, just provided that wonderful maturity, that stability, which you would come to expect from the world's best batsman.
Well, indeed. No, it was a very fine afternoon, I thought.
We're recording this the week after, I think you'd agree with me, one of the most difficult weeks Care has ever had in its long history, and a week where we saw two votes in particular that were desperately sad, and even if they were expected, still represent the very opposite from what you would want as a Christian. So this is the vote to decriminalise abortion in England and Wales, and the vote to pass the assisted suicide bill through its third reading. So it now goes to the Lords. And we can talk a little bit about the procedural stuff to do with these votes, because I think that is quite important in terms of setting expectations as to what happens next. But shall we just reflect first on the vote on the Tuesday to decriminalise abortion? Do you want to maybe say a few things about what happened and what it means?
Yes, well, let's, I think, explain what exactly has been voted on first, because there is sometimes an element of misunderstanding over what this means. So this was Tonia Antionazzi's amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill. So it's not like it's a separate piece of legislation like the assisted suicide vote was. So it's an amendment to a bill. That means that although we knew something was likely to come, we only really had about 3 or 4 weeks warning that it was going to be tagged on to this. What the amendment seeks to do is it means that a woman cannot be criminalised for having an abortion after the 24-week limit. So this does not affect say a medical practitioner or a doctor facilitating an abortion. So a woman still, in theory, shouldn't be able to get an abortion after 24 weeks because a doctor shouldn't allow them to. But if a woman does seek an abortion, all the way potentially even up to full term, for any reason, she cannot be criminalised for it. So although in theory it shouldn't mean that abortions happen more because a doctor shouldn't be allowing it, in practice, particularly given the pills by post scheme, which we can come on to in a second, in practice now, a woman could take whatever action she wanted right up until birth, and that is a pretty dark dystopian position for us to be in.
Yeah, I mean, what we're saying here, what you've just articulated, is the new reality, if this does get through the House of Lords, is that the day before a woman gives birth, if she was to abort that child, then she would face no criminal sanction after this amendment. If, however, the baby was born and in this horrible scenario, she decided to kill her child, then she would face criminal sanctions. Yeah. And the only difference is that the child is out of the womb.
Yeah, and that's not us saying that is what is going to happen, but that is just laying out what the law means.
Yeah, it's the logical scenario that in theory could happen.
Exactly.
And I think your mention of the pills by post scheme, or sometimes called DIY abortions, I think is really important, because I think if it wasn't for that, then it's not that I wouldn't be desperately sad and hugely concerned by this change, but it is the pills by post reality that means it is more likely that there will be cases and there will be some stories potentially where a woman does actually self-administer her own abortion post 24 weeks.
Yes.
Because the way that the pills by post scheme works is you have one, it's called telemedicine, so one online consultation with a medic, and you're trying to basically get hold of two very powerful drugs, two abortion pills that you can now take at home. But there's no check on the online consultation whether you're actually pregnant. And for example, if you wanted to do that, you would have to ask the woman to stand up and maybe turn to the side so you could make a judgment about, does she look like she is, this many weeks pregnant? But that doesn't really happen. It's almost done on a kind of trust basis. And so there have been instances where pills have been sent out to women post the legal limit. So for pills by post, you can have a self-administered abortion ordinarily up to 10 weeks.
Yeah.
But what this amendment does is it removes the protection to stop that from happening post that point, and opens the door to a woman deciding, beyond, as you said, beyond the 24 weeks, maybe 25 weeks, actually, I've changed my mind, I don't want to do this. Yes, she might not go to a medical practitioner, but she could go to an online consultation. She could potentially just lie to the doctors. There's no way they would know, get the pills. And then if that did happen, there'd be no protection in that instance for the unborn baby. And actually, and here's the other point that we always stress at CARE, our position at CARE is that in every pregnancy, both lives matter. And so we don't just think this amendment is bad for unborn babies, we think it's bad for women as well.
Yeah. I was actually going to follow up on that, because the pills by post scheme, if you take the pills beyond the 10-week limit, particularly the further on you go, they actually become quite unsafe for women. Yeah. So it is not a good thing for them either. I think it's also worth saying, before pills by post came in the previous decade, I think there had only been 2 prosecutions for women in a 10-year period. Yeah. And since that scheme came in, that figure has risen much more.
Yes, as has recorded instances of complications in terms of abortion. And of course, if you go back to 1967, the great rationale for the Abortion Act was women are going to Backstreet Abortionists. That's unsafe, which, by the way, it absolutely was. There is also a lack of evidence for how prevalent it was, because there weren't records being kept. A doctor was not about to keep an official record of a dodgy backstreet abortion. So there are questions about some of the claims made in debates back in 1967 about how prevalent backstreet abortions were. But that point wasn't wrong. And so the whole idea of the 1967 Act was that abortion would remain rare, but it would become legal and it would offer some protection for women.
Yeah.
The pills by post scheme, ironically, which was set up during COVID so that women could continue to access abortion when they couldn't go to a approved medical facility, I would argue has sort of reversed what the 67 Act at least was trying to do, which was to make things safer, and has actually placed women in a more vulnerable and more dangerous position. And yet that's called progress, which is really sad.
Oh, I completely agree with that. And I think the other thing to add on this as well is this was, although MPs voted this through very comfortably, they are actually out of step with what most women in the country actually think.
Yeah.
Because the statistics have been quite clear that a majority of women, for instance, want want the time frame on abortion to be reduced from 24 weeks down.
Yes.
So I think it's 70% of British women want the 24-week limit reduced. Currently, the UK is a bit of an outlier in terms of where its time limit is compared to other European countries. So we have 24 weeks. France's limit is 14 weeks. Germany's is 12 weeks. Italy's is 12 weeks. So we're an outlier in that regard. I think only 1% of the public are in favour of abortion up to birth.
Yes.
So this was not a change which people were calling for, but there's an interesting question, I think, about why MPs voted it through.
Yes, and let's come back to that, but just to also, just take this one step further, which is, I think it's important, if the House of Lords approves this and it remains on the statute book and receives royal assent, as part, by the way, of a bill that is all to do with empowering the police to tackle antisocial behaviour, it's got nothing to do with abortion. I think that this will become a stepping stone to further decriminalisation, because if you create a scenario where the woman is decriminalised but medical professionals are criminalised, then I don't think it'll be long before we start hearing campaigners ask why this inconsistency. And in fact, if you look at a campaign plan that BPAS, who are I think either the biggest or the second biggest provider of abortion pills, abortion provider in the country, they're very explicit that their goal is full decriminalisation, including the doctor, including nurses and medical professionals. And so this is not the end of their campaign by any stretch. And that raises, I think, an even more frightening prospect, which is each amendment now, that this one that's passed and any future ones, you are just further removing any legal protection for preborn babies. Yeah. And you are creating, I think, we've said this, an environment where women are actually going to be harmed as a result of this law change. And yet, coming back to your question, why did MPs vote this through? I mean, we were both at the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast just recently, and I was speaking to a couple of MPs after that, and one was an MP, one was a peer, and they were horrified. I mean, genuinely horrified that the House had done this. And I think back to 2015 when a previous MP, Fiona Bruce, a Christian, led an attempt to clarify that sex-selective abortion is absolutely illegal in this country. That is at the very, very minor end of the pro-life spectrum. You know what I mean? Like, everyone should agree that's that. And all she was saying was the law's not clear, let's clarify it. It had 2 votes. The first vote, it passed comfortably. And then what happened was, it was like the other side suddenly woke up and realised that the pro-life side were maybe going to get a legislative win. And they absolutely suddenly marshalled all their forces. And I mean, Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, she was instrumental then in whipping Labour women especially, and Tory women, to vote against Fiona Bruce's amendment at the next opportunity. And it was defeated by a pretty narrow margin. And that was another incredibly devastating day. And I think what that shows, coupled with this amendment, is that for some reason, this issue of abortion in a parliamentary context it's just so locked into MPs' minds that they've got to do this, they've got to vote for it. I think there must be peer pressure at play. I think there must be fear of not being seen to be progressive. I think it's wrapped up, isn't it? It's become wrapped up with women equality for women, that sort of issue, and no one wants to be on the other side of that. And I find it baffling, if I'm honest with you, that they're so out of step with public opinion, and there's so few MPs willing to put their head above the parapet and say, actually, this is too far. Some did, but in too small numbers.
I think at the heart of it is the desire to not be seen as anti-progress. And we can come onto this with the assisted suicide vote as well. But I think MPs are sort of terrified, effectively, of... They are scared of the headline. I think that is my big feeling, particularly on this Parliament, where we have a lot of very new MPs, and where the balance in terms of party power has massively shifted. So more than 400 Labour MPs, around 70 or so Lib Dem MPs. I think both of those parties think that they are on the side of progress. I think that they are. I think that they tend to chase headlines more than good legislation, because no one wants to be at the centre of the headline where it's like MPs vote down kind of move which would have helped women. Like MPs want to avoid that kind of scenario.
And it's all part, though, isn't it, of the dehumanizing of the baby. That for me, that's the thing about decriminalisation is when this first started being talked about. I remember saying in a meeting, this is going to be from a comms point of view for Christians, but also for any secularists who also disagree with it. This is going to be a nightmare, because if you say, I don't agree with decriminalisation of abortion, then it's very easy for the other side to say, so what you're saying is that you are for the criminalisation of women. Now, that in today's kind of political, cultural climate, that is a very difficult line to hold. But of course, in one sense, the answer is, well, I am if they break the law. And I am if I think that they are, wrongly harming the life of another. But of course, that's contested, isn't it? That's what's so difficult, which is we have a view that says life begins at conception and that you are a person with the same legal rights as anyone else from that point. Whereas I think in order to justify this, I think some MPs, whether they do it consciously or not, there's this thing called personhood theory, isn't there? This artificial idea that you basically have to choose an arbitrary point at which the fetus becomes a person, a human. And this is how people like Anne Faroudi, the former chief executive of BPAS, British Pregnancy Advisory Service, can agree with us that life does begin at conception. But then you say, I'm scandalised. So you think it's a life and you still think that we should kill it. And she says, no, because I don't think it's a person until, I think for her, it's after they come out of the womb. And there are extremists, of course, who say, you're not a person until you're 3, when you can make a rational decision for yourself. I think there's an ethicist called Peter Singer who's talked about this. You may have...
so Peter Singer, I think, has said some of the most disturbing things I have ever read. So his views on what makes someone a human are pretty terrifying. So here's a statement which he said about disabled children, and I mean disabled children who are outside the womb at this point. He once said, killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often it is not wrong at all.
That's it, right there. That is personhood theory. And it's wicked, it's evil. And actually, I have been really struck in recent weeks reflecting on this vote are just about, we use the language, don't we, of a better story. So the story of Singer and the story that some MPs are obviously following is the story that essentially we become a human at an unknown point. And society is basically, or Parliament has basically said, you're not really a human worthy of the same protection until you're definitely out the womb. And then you've got Singer saying, actually, it should be older. Whereas in contrast, the Christian worldview, the better story in the Bible, you are a person from the moment you come into existence, from the moment of conception. And that's why we have those wonderful moments in, say, Luke's gospel when Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth and Luke records. And of course, it's fascinating. This comes in the doctor's account. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not in Matthew or Mark or John. It comes in the doctor's account. And we read, at that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And just that lovely idea that John the Baptist, and we don't know exactly at what stage of the pregnancy it was, but of course, we're not told because that's irrelevant. Luke's perspective, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is that John is a person who's able to leap in the womb in response to somehow mysteriously able to recognize the presence of the pre-incarnate, pre-born Jesus Christ. I mean, that to me has always been perhaps the strongest argument from the Bible for why we should care about pre-born babies and protect them.
I think there is also a real irony in MPs thinking that this is a progressive move.
Yes.
Because if you went back 2,000 years ago, we are essentially ending up with the position which we had in the Greco-Roman world.
Yes.
Where an unwanted child you could leave out to die.
Yeah.
In that culture, infanticide was very commonly practiced. And that is where we are heading again.
Yes,
So they think this is progress, when in reality it was always the Christian vision which was progress, which affirmed the genuine dignity and value of every human being.
And I think that's why, what is the trajectory of the world apart from Christianity? It's, if you removed Christians, removed the church, then it would actually be a trajectory of decline.
Yeah.
Because of sin and rebellion and human beings, there's common grace. So there is an ability to make good laws aside from the Holy Spirit and aside from a Christian influence. But I think you would expect alongside that, majorly, there to be this sort of moral chaos that emerges. Romans 1 kind of thing. Though they know God's righteous decree, they choose to disobey it. But because of Christianity, Christianity is the power of the new world that has broken into this world. It's the age to come entering now. It's the kingdom coming from heaven, breaking in. And we see in Jesus that this is all about reversing the effects of the curse and the effects of sin. And so there's this incredible rescue mission that God is on, not just the rescuing of souls, but the rescuing of the entire cosmos. And so that's progress, isn't it? Because everything that the kingdom does and the kingdom values that we see in the Sermon on the Mount is representing the perfect world that is coming. And so thank goodness that Christianity is present in this world and around in other countries. There have been, and here in fact, but there have been amazing examples where Christians have shown up, they've cared for babies, like they did in the ancient world, they've adopted them. And I think this whole thing is a clarion call for the church in this country.
Yeah.
It can't rely on the state to fill all the gaps. It needs to step up and step in. And I think the other thing is so important is we need to keep saying again and again, we know the number of abortions that have happened since 1967 mean the chances of there being a woman in your church who's had an abortion are very, very high. Yeah. So how you speak about this matters enormously. And continually holding out to women who've had an abortion in the past, it is not the unforgivable sin. There is grace, there is forgiveness, there is healing through the cross of Christ and through faith in him. And that, I think that becomes even more important after a law change that may lead to some really horrendous cases coming forward that we need to remember that you're not beyond the grace of God. If that is part of your past, that you can be forgiven and find healing for that. Because, so many women carry guilt and shame and fear because of decisions they made perhaps many years ago. And that has to be part of the church's message as well.
And I think we probably ought to move on to the second vote.
Yes, so this was on the Friday of the same week.
On the Friday, so this was the vote at the third reading of the assisted suicide bill. Kim Ledbetter's terminally ill adults end of life bill.
Yes.
Which passed by 314 to 291.
Yeah.
So it has passed. I guess the margin was smaller than last time.
Yep, it's 55 in November last year. It's now 23, the majority.
Yep, so that has now, well, I guess that has more than halved, hasn't it?
Yes.
The majority, although it still won the vote, there is now less than a majority of MPs who voted for it.
Yes.
Were you surprised at all or not?
No, I wasn't surprised. I think we talked about this quite a lot beforehand, speculating. I think that we thought that the majority would be much smaller, and it was. I think the fact that there were 335 new MPs elected last summer, I've said this since then, has probably been the biggest reason why this bill has passed the Parliament. It's definitely not the quality of the bill. It's a rubbish bill. It's definitely not because people were persuaded by Kim Ledbetter's arguments. They absolutely were not.
Yeah.
Instead, I think it's because a lot of MPs have never really thought about this issue, and I think have sort of fallen into the trap of assuming that this is also progress. And I know we've both written on this idea that this vote really reflects the idea that autonomy is the great chief moral virtue of our time.
Yeah, and I mean, Ironically, that is like the first ever mistake humans made, isn't it?
Yes.
So
yes,
you go back to the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve effectively try to make themselves God. They eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was something which was God's prerogative and not theirs.
Yeah.
And I mean, the big passage I have had in mind over these last few days has been Romans 1.
Yes.
The idea that eventually God gives us over to our desires. So we have made autonomy into our God. And autonomy means sort of law according to yourself.
Yes.
We have decided we want to be in charge of what happens. We don't want any reference to God. And then we will end up facing the consequence of that, because God eventually hands us over to our own desires, like in Romans 1. I remember there's I think a very helpful passage in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Didn't take long.
In C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, where the witch gains life for herself because she eats fruit from a tree which she was forbidden from having. And then Aslan says, she has won her heart's desire. She has unwearying strength and endless days like a goddess, but length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery, and already she begins to know it. And then this is the line, which I think is a real killer line. All get what they want. They do not always like it. And I think that is absolutely going to sum up what happens here. We have chosen as a nation what we want.
Yes.
We are not going to like it when people who feel like they are a burden start saying, actually, I'm going to choose to die early. When people who feel disabled feel pressured into it. When people who have Down syndrome end up saying yes because they feel like a doctor is suggesting death to them. As a nation, I think we will look back on the events of these last few months and we will think, what on earth did we do?
Yeah, I hope that applies to the issue we've already talked about as well. But I had a verse that I thought was, again, sort of sums up everything we've just said on both issues. But that's Isaiah 5:20. You get these series of woes. And then 5:20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And it's that idea, isn't it, of same as Romans 1, topsy-turvy, where everything's the wrong way round. And it's this, again, Romans 1 is, you can almost feel the descent into moral chaos. And it's the reversing of what God does in Genesis 1, where he brings order to chaos. What humanity does when it rebels against him is we actually bring chaos to order. And again, I think the assisted suicide one is so sad because it feels like it's the first step. And in future years, in Canada, it took 5 years before there was expansion to the criteria for eligibility. How long before we see the same calls being made, given that some MPs have already asked for it to be expanded even before it got out of committee? And so at the moment, if you're terminally ill with 6 months or less to live, and you're an adult who passes all of the various so-called safeguards, you will sue by 2029. You'll be able to access this, provided the Lords doesn't block it. But 2035, what about if you're mentally ill and you're depressed and weary of life, and everything you mentioned as well about people with disabilities? Terminal illness no longer is the criteria. It's a Pandora's box, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think actually the amendment which was defeated, which really brought home exactly what had been voted for, was Amendment NC 16, which was from Rebecca Paul. So this amendment would have meant that someone who met the 6-month prognosis but would still not be able to access assisted suicide if any of the following was actually the driving factor in their decision. So here's the list: feeling like a burden, mental illness, including depression, disability, financial considerations, lack of access to treatment, or a desire to commit suicide. So if you are in the last 6 months of your life, but any of those reasons are the actual reason why you want to have an assisted suicide, then MPs have voted you're entitled to do that. So even if it is that you feel like you are impoverished, you are allowed to have an assisted suicide if you're in your last 6 months of your life.
And that was the most shocking of the amendments that was rejected. And they even it's well known that during committee, the committee voted to give the Welsh Parliament a say over whether it consented to this law applying in Wales as well. And then in third reading, the MPs, predominantly English MPs, voted to disenfranchise the Welsh Parliament. Now, subsequently, then the Welsh Parliament is still going to hold a vote on whether to offer assisted suicide on the NHS in Wales. So I'm really glad that they've done that, because we've been involved at CARE in too many occasions where the Westminster Parliament has essentially just trampled over devolution.
And abortion laws.
Exactly, ignored it. And so I'm glad the Welsh Parliament stepping in. I think on this issue of assisted suicide bill passing and everything we've said, and you know, there are stories from Canada as well about how, because laws send social signals and because they do change culture, that now, nearly a decade on from assisted suicide being legalized in Canada, I was talking to a colleague who studied there for a while, has friends in the evangelical church there, and he was telling me that it's now quite common within an evangelical church in Canada that there'll be a larger group who will just sort of basically think that this is okay. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges now for the church moving forward is how do you help people who are not going to avoid perhaps real suffering at the end of their lives? How do you help them to hold the line and to see and to understand that it's at the end of the day, it's not our right to choose when we die or indeed how we die. That's something that the Lord, our times are in his hands. You know, 1 Samuel 2:6 in Hannah's great prayer and praise, the Lord gives life, the Lord takes life. And at the end of the day, that's it. Like it's a bit like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God has not given us the right to choose and decide for ourselves. But what he has given us the right to do is walk with one another through suffering, carry each other's burdens. And that's why palliative care and quality end-of-life care is so dignity-giving, because it can manage pain in nearly every instance.
Yeah.
But it also looks after the other concerns. And John Wyatt talks about this, doesn't he? Professor John Wyatt in his books about how the great insight that Dame Cicely Saunders, the pioneer of palliative care and the hospice movement, had was that pain at the end of life is total. And so palliative care was designed to address total pain by offering total care. And, you know, Wes Streeting coming out saying there's no money for assisted suicide. Starmer, the Prime Minister, slaps him down and says, no, there is. What I fear is that if this passes the Lords, palliative care, which is in desperate need of more funding, will suffer. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, it is a financial thing, isn't it? It's much cheaper to use assisted suicide than to care for someone for months on end, either in hospital or in a care home or in a hospice.
Completely. MP after MP bemoaned the state of palliative care in this country, and the fact that there is a postcode lottery, so essentially where you are in the country will determine the quality of the care which you would get, and that is a desperately sad position for us to be in. I know Gordon Brown wrote in the week before the vote a really helpful article where he said, look, I mean, you're all about choice, but how can this be choice if you can't choose the other option?
That is exactly right. And I think there's another question which is worth just briefly reflecting on, which is I can totally understand, and I've felt this myself, you know, perhaps you watching and listening to this, you wrote to your MP and you prayed that the result would be different. And, you know, we've been doing fasts for supporters in Scotland about the assisted suicide bill there. And I can totally get it if someone says, I did all of that, and yet the Lord didn't answer, he didn't seem to hear. And I've found, in situations like this, I've often found the prophecy of Habakkuk really helpful, because Habakkuk grapples with violence and injustice all around him, and he just doesn't get it, because he knows what God is like. He knows that God hates these things. And he even says that at one point, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. So what's going on? And what I find so interesting is the Lord doesn't jump to what he goes on to say, which is he does give him real hope. He starts by saying it's about to get a whole lot worse.
Yeah, completely. And God's purposes are often obscure to us. I am always very cautious when someone says they think they know what God is doing behind the scenes, because I just don't think we are normally given that kind of knowledge.
No.
Certainly in response to the vote, both votes, I have found some of the Psalms really helpful. I think it is a great encouragement that God puts so many Psalms of lament into His Word, and that therefore we know that is a completely legitimate way to pray.
Yes.
Sort of how long, O Lord? But Psalm 10, I think, is quite helpful actually in particular, because much of it sort of maps on in some ways to what we've seen in the last few days. So it sort of begins, why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? But then it talks about, effectively, the way in which sometimes wicked men hunt down the weak or take advantage of the vulnerable, and how they think, actually, they are in control. Nothing will ever shake me. No one will ever do me harm. They think that there is no room for God. God will never notice. Or I guess in today's world, there isn't a God, and he can never see, and he can never judge me. But we do know, and this is where the psalm goes in verse 14, you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief, and you take it in hand. And goes on to say, you are the helper of the fatherless. So I guess it holds multiple things in tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There are moments where the wicked do seem to prosper. And I do absolutely think that this bill, regardless of whether the motivations behind it are well-intentioned, I believe that this is a really bad, damaging, dare I say, wicked piece of legislation, which will have an immensely bad impact on vulnerable people. Sometimes things do happen like that, where it seems like evil has the upper hand.
Yeah.
But we also know that God does see the trouble of the afflicted. He does still care. And one day he will make all that is wrong right again.
Yeah, and this is such a big part of how God ultimately answers every question we might have. Yeah, which is we're pointed again and again to our ultimate future. You have it in the Psalms, you have it in the prophets. I mean, it's exactly there in Habakkuk, just kind of nestled into the Lord's second reply to Habakkuk's second complaint is this stunning verse that just says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And you get to sort of Revelation and it becomes clear what that means. And I love how, I think lament, grief, bringing it to the Lord, being honest with him about how we're feeling is all the beginning of a response. I think then the church has a challenge to teach well on this, to help people to understand the better story of palliative care, of hospice care, of how many churches are giving generously to a hospice in their community. Hospices, it costs £1.8 billion to run the hospices across the UK. They get a quarter of that from the government. The rest they have to get themselves. Yeah. So is that something your church can do? And then I think the other thing that we need to hold on to is that bigger picture of where we're going, that the day's coming when the shadows flee away, when abortion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and all the injustices are put right. And it sort of fuels Habakkuk's prayer at the end of he's come through fear and he's come to a place again of faith. Yeah. And I suspect there's still some elements of fear within him because we're often a mixture, but faith is one. Because he prays that God will come and repeat great deeds in his day. And I think that's also got to be part of our response. That what would it look like for this to be overturned? And that's not humanly unlikely, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that in lots of Bible passages like this, so whether it is Habakkuk or whether it is the Psalms or whether it is Job, we ask the question why. Yeah. And God doesn't answer that. What he does do is he asks the question back, who? Yes. Like, who am I?
Yes.
And that is that is ultimately how we come to that place
Yes.
of faith and trust again, as we look at who God is and what he's like and what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've been chatting for quite a while.
Yes.
Anything else to cover?
No, all I would say is I think it is worth anyone who wants to understand these issues more, just heading to our website.
Yeah.
Whether you could find, we've now got primer videos on both assisted suicide and abortion. We have a range of prayer resources covering both issues. We also have a range of other resources on our website, including some on assisted suicide, a topic guide that's got some really helpful articles from Professor John Wyatt, also from Amanda, who's from Canada, and is really helpful on the situation. They're just really helpful ways of better understanding, what this means for us as a country and what we can expect. So I just encourage you, if you want to understand these issues better, then head to the website care.org.uk. If you go to our causes section, topic section, you will find lots on abortion and lots on assisted suicide, and we're constantly adding to it and filling the gaps, which is your great mission at the moment. So,
indeed.
So yes, I think really worth doing that.
It does occur to me one thing which we probably ought to just round off by saying is what happens next for the assisted suicide bill.
Yes, so the assisted suicide bill now moves to the House of Lords. It's had its first reading in the House of Lords already. We're expecting second reading. So it goes through the same process as in the Commons, just again in the House of Lords. Second reading is expected probably in September. If it gets enough time and if there are no dark arts deployed by peers who don't like this bill, then it could get royal assent by Christmas. I think that is unlikely because I think there will be lots and lots and lots that peers will want to chew over. And I think they will look at this and recognise this as a badly drafted bill.
Yeah.
I think they will make changes.
Yeah.
That ultimately means when they've gone through that whole process, it will then come back to the Commons and the Commons can either reject or approve. And this is called ping pong, where it moves between the houses until everyone's agreed. And this is the really important thing. If this was a government bill, then by convention, the House of Lords does not overturn a government bill that originates in the House of Commons. This is a finely balanced.
Although, of course, it did over Rwanda.
It did over Rwanda, but that was hugely controversial because it kind of broke the centuries of convention. But anyway, it doesn't matter. This is not a government bill. This is a private member's bill. And so I think the House of Lords should and will feel at more liberty to make changes, potentially even sort of really push it back on the Commons and say this is not up to scratch. So it's not a done deal that assisted suicide becomes legal in England and Wales from 2029. But while it's become a lot more likely, there is still some hope that at the very least the House of Lords might mitigate some of the worst elements of this bill.
Yes, that's what I am. That would be my position as well. I am hopeful that some of the most dystopian bits will be taken out or amended. Yeah. Great to chat.
Yeah, as ever. We have reached a point where, that last week in Parliament, I've never known anything like it. I'm speaking to colleagues who've been at CARE longer than I have, including Lyndon, our co-founder, and Celia, his wife. They've never known a week like it, where you had such significant votes, the beginning of life and the end of life, in 1 week.
I know.
One final thing, it was a classic example of Christian advocacy and what it's like to be a Christian in politics, because buried in the middle of that week was a win for us at CARE. We've been pushing the government to make sure that suffocation and strangulation are banned when it comes to pornography. And finally, the government have conceded and said they will do so. Yeah. And they've also said they will take steps to bring more parity between offline protections for young people from harmful content and porn and online protections. And so we didn't make much of it because our minds were obviously focused on these massive life and death votes. But, that's what Christian involvement in politics is like. You know, you lose, but there are these moments where you can make progress and you can win. So praise God for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Peter, as ever, a huge pleasure.
Indeed.
I hope you get something for your breakfast. I'm so sorry again about the cookie. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like it. Please tell your friends about it. Please share it with them. Please leave us positive reviews. Please get in touch with us if there's issues that you would like us to talk about on this podcast. And we are so grateful to all of you who do comment and who have come up to us at different events and just told us, I really appreciate the podcast. We've been amazed and genuinely delighted and humbled that from young to old, this seems to be useful to people. And if that ever stopped being the case, we'd carry on because we enjoy it. But it means that's what it's all about. We're just trying to be helpful. So please let us know if we're being helpful, how we're being helpful, how we could be even more helpful. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Care Org UK. Peter, until next time.
Very good.
Bless you. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.